All right. Next section, questions 33 to 42 are based on the following passages. Passage 1 is adapted from a speech delivered in 1898 by Albert J. Beveridge. March of the Flag. Passage 2, okay, so there's two passages. Passage 2 is adapted from a speech delivered in 1900 by William Jennings Bryan, Imperialism. All right, so here's passage 1, here's passage 2. So the questions, as we always do, 33 to 42. These are the questions. In passage 1, Beveridge asserts that the resources and immensity of the United States Constitution constitute okay, so passage 1, Beveridge asserts that the resources and immensity of the United States constitutes a resources and immensity of the U.S. In the second paragraph of passage 1, lines 26 to 41, the commands given by Beveridge mainly serve to, okay, so 26 to 41, question 34. And we got to pay attention to Bev's commands. As used in line 72, recalled most nearly means lines on 72. 172, recalled. Okay, recalled. It can be reasonably inferred from passage 2 that Bryan considers a preference for national sovereignty over foreign rule to be a. It's passage 2. Bryan, national sovereignty versus foreign rule. So Bryan, national sovereignty versus foreign rule. Foreign rule. It's passage 2. Okay, we put it under passage 2, so we know. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? So 36 and 37 are connected. Using line 85, calculate most nearly means. 85, calculate. Developing their respective arguments, Beveridge, hold on, 35, 38. This is 35. This is 38. Okay. In developing their respective arguments, Beveridge passage 1 and Bryan passage 2 both express admiration for the, okay. So both passage 1 and passage 2 express admiration for, I'm going to put it here, both P1 and P2 authors express admiration for. Which choice best describes a central difference between how Beveridge, passage 1, and Bryan, passage 2, view the concept of liberty as it is realized in the United States? So what is central difference? Central difference between how Bev and Bryan view the concept of liberty. So different views of liberty between P1 and P2. The difference between their views of liberty. Okay. It can most reasonably be inferred from passage 2 that Bryan would criticize the vision of American governance on island territories that Beveridge presents in passage 1 for being. Okay, hold on. So you can surmise from passage 2 that the author would criticize the vision of American governance of island territories that passage 1's author presents for being, okay. So how does passage 2's author criticize passage 1's author's view of American governance of island territories? Let's rewrite that. of island territories. Cool. And then 42, 41 are connected. Okay. So we should really write this over here. Criticize P1 authors' view of U.S. governance of island territories. Cool. All right, well, let's do it. Fellow citizens, it is a noble land that God has given us, a land that can feed and clothe the world, a land whose coastlines would enclose half the countries of Europe, a land set like a sentinel between the two imperial oceans of the globe, a greater England with a nobler destiny. It is a mighty people that he planted on this soil, a people sprung from the most masterful blood of history, a people perpetually revitalized by the virile working folk of all of the earth. Okay, so let's see how he feels about it. It is a mighty people. He's planted on this soil, sprung from the most masterful blood of history. Okay, so these are all positive connotations. Positive. The author of the first passage feels positively about the people. Okay. A people imperial by virtue of their power, by right of their institutions, by authority of their heaven-directed purposes, the propagandists and not the misers of liberty. It is a glorious history our God has bestowed upon his chosen people. A history whose keynote was struck by a Liberty Bell. A history heroic with faith in our mission and our future. Let's write that down. History heroic with faith in our mission and our future. A history of statement.
The 1996 movie A Face to Die For was written by Marvin Werlin.
Hold on. We got Siri over here talking.
The 2013 movie Gil Futuro was written by Roberto Bolaño.
Okay, sorry about that. Siri talking out of nowhere. Where were we? A history heroic with faith in our mission and our future. A history of statesmen who flung the boundaries of the Republic out into unexplored lands. A history of soldiers who carried the flag across blazing deserts and through the ranks of hostile mountains. Okay, a history of soldiers who carried across blazing deserts through ranks of hostile mountains. Okay, so they're heroic. Brave. Even to the gates of sunset, a history of a multiplying people who overran a continent in half a century. A history divinely logical, in the process of whose tremendous reasoning we find ourselves today. Think of the thousands of Americans who will pour into Hawaii and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico instead of Puerto Rico. Think of the thousands of Americans who will pour into Hawaii and Puerto Rico when the Republic's laws cover those islands with justice and safety. Okay, so this is how he feels about, the governance of island territories, right? He feels that the Republic, that's us, the U.S. laws cover those islands with justice and safety. How P1 author feels of U.S. governance of island territories. Think of the tens of thousands of Americans who will invade the Philippines when a liberal government shall establish order and equity there. So he feels they establish order and equity. Think of the hundreds of thousands of Americans who will build a civilization of energy and industry in Cuba when a government of law replaces the double reign of anarchy and tyranny. So they're going to build a civilization of energy and industry in Cuba, and they're going to replace anarchy and tyranny. So he's all for it. He's all for taking over the islands. Think of the prosperous millions that empress of islands will support when, obedient to the law of political gravitation, Her people ask for the highest honor liberty can bestow, the sacred order of the stars and stripes, the citizenship of the great republic. Okay, highest honor liberty can bestow is the citizenship of the great republic. So, very pro-imperialism. Should we look at the passage 1 questions? See if there's any we can answer. In passage 1, Beveridge asserts that the resources and immensity of the United States constitute a safeguard against foreign invasion, replicative conditions. Passage 1, lines 34 recalled. I mean, we can answer the first 3 questions. All right, let's do it. Let's answer the first 3 questions. In passage 1, Beveridge asserts that the resources and immensity of the United States constitute a safeguard against foreign invasion, replication of conditions in Europe. I don't remember anything about conditions of Europe. Divine gift to the American people, yes. Source of envy for people in other countries. They never talk about envy. And they never really talk about foreign invasion either. I'm going to have to go with C. In the second paragraph of passage 1, lines 26 to 41, the commands given by Beveridge mainly serve to... Commands given by Beveridge from lines 26. Bev's commands. So this is a speech, and Beveridge is the speaker, is the orator of the speech. So these are all the great things that they're going to do, okay, once they imperialize. So in the second paragraph, the command can serve mainly to remind the audience of its civic responsibilities, anticipate the benefits of a proposed policy. Okay, I'm not sure about which policy, but anticipate the benefits, yeah. I'm going to say no to A. Emphasize, because remind the audience of its civic responsibilities. I don't think the audience has... He's trying to convince the audience of civic responsibilities. Refute arguments that opponents have advanced. I don't think he's trying to refute any arguments. Emphasize the urgency of a national problem. I don't think there's... What's the national problem? Establish order and equity. Think of hundreds of thousands of Americans who will build a civilization of energy. Replace the stolen from her. Think of the prosperous millions and support of being. Okay, I don't see a national problem. There's different nations being invaded. They talk about Cuba. Puerto Rico isn't a nation, but it's a separate place of islands. They talk about the Philippines. So I don't think there's one national problem that they're referring to. So I'm going to go with B. As used in line 72, recalled most nearly means repeated, retracted, rejected, remembered. Line 35. 72. Someone has said, oh, we're not there yet. Okay, so it's time for passage 2 then. Okay, let's read passage 2. If it is right for the United States to hold the Philippine Islands permanently and imitate European empires and the government of colonies, the Republican Party ought to state its position and defend it, but it must expect the subject races to protest against such a policy and to resist to the extent of their ability. Okay, whoa. What are they saying here? They're saying if it's right for the U.S. to hold Philippine Islands forever, you know, copying what Europeans used to do with imperialism, then they ought to, you know, stand behind that. But they should expect that those who are being imperialized will resist it. Okay, so already we're more like anti-imperialism here. Anti-imperialism. Right, this first paragraph is just saying expect resistance from those imperialized. The Filipinos do not need any encouragement from Americans now living. Our whole history, so this person is Filipino, our whole history has been an encouragement not only to the Filipinos, but to all who are denied a voice in their own government. Our whole history has been an encouragement not only to the Filipinos, but to all who are denied a voice in their own government. So their history has been an encouragement to all who are denied a voice in their own government. The Republicans, so that's how they feel the imperialized are. They have no voice in their own government. If the Republicans are prepared to censure all who have used language calculated to make the Filipinos hate foreign domination, so if the U.S. is ready to censor anyone who perpetuates Filipinos going against their imperialism, let them condemn the speech of Patrick Henry. When he uttered that passionate appeal, "Give me liberty or give me death," he expressed a sentiment which still echoes in the hearts of men. Okay. Give me liberty or give me death. Right. He wants freedom or he doesn't want anything at all. Let them censure Jefferson. Of all the statesmen of history, none have used words so offensive to those who would hold their fellows in political bondage. Of all the statesmen of history, none have used words so offensive to those who would hold their fellows in political bondage. Let them censure Washington, who declared that the colonists must choose between liberty and slavery. Washington, colonists must choose between liberty and slavery. Or if the statute of limitations has run against the sins of Henry and Jefferson and Washington, let them censure Lincoln, whose Gettysburg speech will be quoted in defense of popular government when the present advocates of force and conquest are forgotten. Okay, wow. Very academic speech over here. Someone has said that a truth once spoken can never be recalled. Okay, it can never be retracted. Redacted, retracted, taken back. It goes on, and no one can set a limit to its ever-widening influence. Right, it just widespreads like wildfire. But if it were possible to obliterate every word written or spoken in defense of the principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence, a war of conquest would still leave its legacy of perpetual hatred, for it was God himself who placed in every human heart the love of liberty. God himself placed in every human heart love of freedom, of liberty. He never made a race of people so low in the scale of civilization or intelligence that it would become a foreign master. It would welcome a foreign master. So no one would ever welcome a foreign master. No one would ever welcome a foreign master. Those who would have this nation enter upon a career of empire must consider not only the effect of imperialism on the Filipinos, but they must also calculate its effects upon our own nation. Take into account. Consider. Take into account. Consider. We cannot repudiate the principle of self-government in the Philippines without weakening that principle here. We cannot go against the principle of self-government in the Philippines without weakening that principle here, without weakening the principle of self-government in America. Okay. That was a tougher read than the first one. All right, we answered questions 1 and 2 already. In line 72, recalled most nearly means. 72. Recalled. We said retracted, taken back. Repeated, retracted. B. Rejected, remembered. Okay, cool. I love when that happens. When the actual word that we put just off the cuff is the same one as an actual answer. You know that's the right one, then. It can be reasonably inferred from passage 2 that Bryan considers a preference for national sovereignty over foreign rule to be okay, so you consider passage 2. Passage 2 is anti-imperialism. And he considers the preference for national sovereignty over foreign rule to be a common thing. Do you think that's normal? That is a God-given expression that he's given to everyone. Rule to be a reaction to the excessive imperial government in the modern era? No. It is a sign that the belief in human equality is widespread. I don't think they said anything about human equality. Testament to the effects of foreign policy on the United States. Manifestation, I think D. I think D, the manifestation of an innate drive in humans towards self-rule. And the reason I feel like that is because at the end, he's saying that God himself placed in every human heart the love of liberty. He never made a race of people who would welcome a foreign master. So he's saying if God placed it within themselves, then it is an innate drive in human beings towards self-rule. So that would be my answer. Which choice provides the best evidence for that? Oh, well, we just looked at 76, 77, 78. Like 78 to 81, somewhere around that. 79 to 81. He never mastered. I'm going to put C then, because that's what I used as my evidence. As used in line 85, calculate most nearly means. Calculate. 85. Calculate. Take into account, consider. So design, assume, multiply, evaluate, consider, take into account. That's the closest answer. In developing their respective arguments, Beveridge passage 1 and Bryan passage 2 both express admiration for the... Okay, so they're considering both their arguments. Passage 1's author and passage 2 author both express admiration for founding and history of the United States. Okay, vibrancy and diversity of American culture. Huh. Worldwide history of struggles for independence. Idealism that permeates many aspects of American society. Wow. Okay, I don't think A. Although maybe. Hold on. Definitely not B. American culture. Worldwide history of struggles of independence. I don't think C. Because passage 1 was really pro-imperialism, and it wasn't about rooting for the underdog. So idealism that permeates many aspects of American society. What about American society? I never really said that. So, from Americans now living, the idealism, those who have had a nation enter upon a career must either consider not only the effect of penalty, but they must calculate its effect on its own nation. Okay. So those who would have this nation enter upon a career of empire, so of taking over other lands, must consider not only the effect of imperialism on the Filipinos, but they must also evaluate its effects on their own nation. We cannot go against the principle of self-government in the Philippines without weakening that principle here. So if you go against self-government elsewhere, you're going against self-government of yourself, is what they're saying. So the founding of the history of the United States. Idealism that permeates many aspects of American society. Idealism, founding of the history of the United States. You know, because of all this talk about Jefferson and Washington and Patrick Henry, these are all American founders, and Lincoln, and he still shows respect for them. You know, he's saying if you're going to talk about them, you got to talk about your own people too. So I'm going to go with that they respect American history. Because clearly this guy loves imperialism and thinks America's great and whatever else. He writes that here. It's revitalized by Vero, working folk people, propagandists, he's chosen people. Like, he's all for Americans. This guy respects Americans, but is criticizing them a bit. But he's talking about Jefferson. He's talking about Washington. He's talking about Henry, Lincoln at the Gettysburg speech address. So I'm going to go with they respect the founding and history of the United States. Right? Because he definitely respects the history of the United States to go into that so deeply. Which choice best describes the central difference between how Beveridge, passage 1, and Bryan, passage 2, view the concept of liberty as it is realized in the United States? Which choice best describes the central difference, or the main difference between how author of passage 1 and author of passage 2 view the concept of freedom as it is realized in the United States? So what's the main difference of their concepts of freedom? So passage 1 author presents it as a direct inheritance of the European colonization, whereas passage 2 presents it as a sharp beak from earlier governments in Europe. Sharp break. Whereas Bryan presents it as a sharp break from earlier governments in Europe. Maybe. Passage 1 author considers it so exemplary as to justify conquest of other regions, liberty, whereas passage 2 author warns that its exemplary quality would be undermined by imperial expansion. Gosh darn it. What? Beveridge argues that it rose organically as the United States matured, whereas Bryan argues that it was present from the country's beginnings. I don't think that's the answer. Beveridge regards, and I don't think that's the answer because it doesn't. Passage 2 never really mentions anything about from its beginnings. And passage 1 never talks about it organically rising. Passage 1 regards it as a model that should be shared with other countries, whereas passage 2 believes that it's unique to the United States and could not work elsewhere. Liberty? No, he wants liberty elsewhere. Definitely not that one. What direct inheritance of European coastline enclosed half the coast of Europe, like a sentinel between two imperial oceans of globe, Greater England with a noble destiny, mighty people, he's planted on soil, spring. Okay, I could see direct inheritance. Oh. While passage 2 presents it as a sharp break from earlier governments in Europe. What, liberty as a sharp break from earlier governments? If it is right for the United States to hold the Philippine Islands permanently and imitate European empires and the government's colonies, the Republican audit state's position to defend it would expect their subject races to protest against policy and resist the extent of their ability. So he doesn't think it's a sharp break if they're going to imitate the earlier governments, right? He's saying imitate European empires and the government of their colonies. So if he thinks it's imitating the past European empires, it wouldn't be a sharp break, right? But maybe that's the whole point. View the concept of liberty as it's realized in the United States. But it's realized in the United States. No, I don't think that makes sense. It wouldn't be a sharp break. It would be imitating, like you said. It's imitating. Beveridge considered it so exemplary as to justify conquest of other regions, whereas passage 2 warns that his exemplary would be undermined by imperial expansion. I'm going to go with B. For all the reasons why I explained. These two don't really make sense, they're not really mentioned. And then this one says imitate. So imitate contradicts sharp break. And so by process of elimination, this would be the best answer. It can most reasonably be inferred from passage 2 that Bryan would criticize the vision of American governance of island territories that Beveridge presents in passage 1 for being unrealistic, since most Americans would be unwilling to relocate. No. Deceptive, since economic domination would be a true goal of the American government. Never mentions anything about economic domination. Impractical, since the islanders would insist upon equal distribution of resources. Never talked about resources. Naive, since islanders would object to being governed by Americans. D. That's it. His whole point is, from the very first paragraph, is you must suspect the subject races, subject to imperialism, to protest against such a policy and to resist the extent of their ability. They're going to fight back. So they would object to being governed by Americans. Also, right, we already said here that God made a race of people who would never be welcome to a foreign master. So they would definitely object to it. So we have what lines for evidence? We said 45 onward, 45 to like 49. 42 to 48. If to ability. This first paragraph. That works. Yeah, A should work. Because that was one of our things.